objectives of our session today, by the end of the session, you should be able to at least define big data. You should be able to identify causes of performance gaps that may lend themselves to big data solutions, and you should be able to identify potential big data applications for HPI practitioners. And the way that we'll move through this session is that we'll do a brief warm-up. We'll give you some examples and talk through some examples of big data applications. We'll talk about learning and development and performance improvement applications to dive further into where you might fit in. We'll map our causes to potential big data solutions. We'll look at our organizations and other examples of people that are using big data in performance improvement today. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to spot potential opportunities to use big data applications in your work. And finally, we'll finish up with a question and answer portion of our session. So just to test things out, I have a fun question to get us started, and that question is, who rocks? So if you would just try this out with us, either by texting the answer to who rocks to 37607, you can write that right in your text box there, or you can go online to pollev.com/Lisa Giacumo 351. And I see we already have a couple of correct answers.
So Border Collies rock. Kristen rocks. Boise rocks. So 37607 is the phone number. And then the answer now should be to who rocks.
Who rocks? I see Steve rocks. I see cold weather rocks.
The border rocks.
You guys are doing a great job. All right. Opal rocks. Very good. Excellent.
ISPI rocks.
ISPI does rock. James rocks.
Babs rocks.
All right. So we'll move on. It looks like people are starting to get the hang of it. So we're going to give you another opportunity to interact a little bit. How would you define big data? So if you can text your answer, we'll take a look at how we all define big data. Hours of transcription is the first. Poorly is the second. It's okay to take a stab. The answers all come in anonymously, so
all the data on the web. Big data is intrusive. Relevant.
Huge.
Huge. I like the all caps best.
Yes.
High volume. Buzzword.
That is quite the buzzword these days.
And it's part of other sets of buzzwords like cloud, mobile, digitification. Lots of data from many sources.
Yeah.
It's data analysis. Hopefully it's evidence. Another for data analysis. Time consuming. Computer modeling. Machine learning. Automation as an outcome. So big that traditional processing software can't deal with them. All the data captured by all the different sources. Somebody texted the number again. Data stewardship. Computer modeling.
All right. Well, it just so happens that there is no single common definition for big data. However, if you look back through the literature, you'll find that one of the definitions comes up quite a bit. And this definition is found mostly in the business world and the computer science world, as well as the data science world. And up until 2001, you really saw that defined with the 3 V's. And the 3 V's stood for volume, velocity, and variety. However, more recently, since 2011, we see a lot of times that big data has becoming defined with 4 V's. And the last V that has been included in this definition is value. And the reason is because along with a high volume, so more data than what we can process with traditional software systems, velocity refers to the real-time, up to the minute decisions that can be made with updated information, continuously updated information. The variety stands for both structured and unstructured data. So structured data, an example of structured data would be perhaps maybe the vitals that your nurse takes of you when you're in the doctor's office or the hospital. Or maybe it's a survey response, strongly agree to strongly disagree, one of the five. Or another structured example of data might be the hours that you spend logged into a computer website. And unstructured data is text data or audio data or video data, or some sort of data that doesn't fit nicely and neatly into one specific box. And so when you combine both that structured data as well as the unstructured data, along with up-to-the-minute data and large volumes of data, then you have your big data definition. And like I said, in 2011, people started talking about, well, that's great that you can collect all this data, but if you can't find a reason to derive value from it, then you're just having data to have data. It's not a big data approach to decision making. So that's where the fourth B came in to play. However, in addition to this definition that's really designed for the business world and the computer science world, we often find ourselves here in the L&D space and the PI space wrestling with smaller amounts of data than what some of the more traditional computer scientists might look at as big data. And so for our context, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. Let's go back a minute. So if you can just text us or go to the online website and provide one example of big data that you've encountered in your own personal life or career.
So none so far. Facebook. Log analytics. Transcribing recorded interviews.
So like with the Google API, where you can feed in audio files and have it transcribed, and then feed that into a system.
30,000 learning objectives in the LMS. Targeted advertising, Siri, financial data in Mint.
Yelp takes data from GPS coordinates, it takes data from users, it takes data from Google Maps. Google Maps is also a very interesting example of big data and augmented reality. It will give you more information than you would get just by looking at the building on the street. Credit card statement, yep. Traffic warnings on Google Maps, sure, that's all coming from big data as well. So you guys have picked up quite a few examples of big data applications that you can see in your life.
A project for targeting specific coupons to targeted customers at CVS.
Yeah. That also comes from big data for sure. So inside of our performance improvement space, we feel that there is a need for a different definition that's specifically for us. And so the definition that we'd like to propose that we move forward with in this field is the ethical collection of data points from a volume of either learners or employees in a given population over enough time to show patterns or changes in patterns with the velocity required for timely policy, program, or organizational management decisions that come from a variety of both primary and secondary sources intended to result in added value in the learner's or organizational performance. And that also comes out of a literature review that I recently completed and is in press. I will show up in the quarterly review of distance education later on this year or early next year. So we have another question for you all. We're curious. Are your bosses and executives talking about big data? You can text A for yes, B for no, or C for I don't know.
So you get almost people saying yes and no, and then about twice, the numbers are slightly changing on I don't know. I guess what's interesting is that you see big data appearing in a lot of the CIO literature. You see it appearing in some of the CEO literature as execs start comparing things that they're doing and projects they're working on. Where we're saying I don't know, there may be an interesting opportunity to follow Roger Addison's advice and see if big data is appearing on the reports that those executives are using to drive business decisions and track their performance against their bonuses.
Yep. It's all very interesting. So another question we'd like to ask is, are your clients using big data for anything? And if so, what are your clients using them for?
And we're using the term client whether you are an external vendor or an internal employee. We're all serving clients.
Right.
We can't hear you.
Uh-oh. What are your clients using big data for? Can you hear us now? Forecasting. And we're thinking of your clients as being either internal or external. So perhaps you consult internally inside of an organization, or perhaps you are consulting externally as a vendor for another client organization.
So we have comments about tracking, prediction, forecasting, determining why people are calling us. That might be a call center application. They're not there yet, but they're starting to think about it in terms of sales. That's probably forecasting and tracking. Student records, resource alignment, retention, a big thing in higher ed. Yes, it is. Adaptive learning pathways, so people don't need to complete training that they don't need and can focus on the training they do.
Right.
So there's a wide range of places where clients might be using big data. It seems to be on their radar.
Yeah. Sales forecasting. All right. Well, it turns out that we do fit in as learning and development or performance improvement specialists, and there is a need for us to start to think about when we might actually recommend a big data solution to our clients.
And so this is a place where big data starts coming into things that we already know and do. So as performance improvement practitioners, we will look at a problem or an opportunity. We'll frame that problem or opportunity in terms of some sort of a performance gap. We'll look at whether or not that performance gap is worth closing. And having done those things, we then go to cause analysis. And we typically look at environmental and individual causes of performance gaps. Those environmental causes could be information, resources, incentives. The individual causes could deal with skills, capacity, motives. When we're dealing with big data, those things aren't going to change. Our causes of non-performance, the things that help people perform to standard, are still going to be the same.
So what we've done for our workshop today is to take the just a standard BEM adapted from Gilbert and Chevalier and start to piece together and show you examples of how things fit together. So the first example we'll go through is it's a pseudonym for an organization that I used to work for. We'll call them World Health. And this is a common problem inside of World Health. The case starts off with, the CEO understanding that we're bleeding new hires, right? The NGO is providing assistance throughout troubled parts of the world. The CEO says we hire them, we start training them, and then we get them into the field so that they can make a difference. They typically stay for around 6 months, then they leave. From what we know, they go to other NGOs or leave for technical work in other sectors. So deployed with World Health. And that will save World Health about $10 million annually by avoiding unnecessary hiring and training costs. It will support flexible staffing in unfolding emergencies, and it'll help, if we keep our staff, we'll also have higher levels of engagement and goodwill throughout the organization. But what it's actually doing is our new hires are leaving now, usually within 6 months, to seek other employment opportunities. And so that's costing us a lot of money. It's producing low engagement, low morale throughout the organization, and it's interfering with our ability to operate successfully as a World Health. So when you plot that against the BEM, you'll find that there's a lot of opportunities for both environmental changes as well as changes at the individual level. And you'll see that when we look and we consider, for example, the information column on the BEM, right? Within the information column, we have the cause analyzed, again, at both the environmental level and the individual level. At the environmental level, when we think about roles and expectations, we find that the new hires, supervisors, and managers have no formally specified roles or expectations for onboarding. So that's obviously a cost contributing to this problem. Also, when we think about guidance for work processes, we also learn that new hires, supervisors, and managers lack relevant, timely, and accurate sources of guidance to support the onboarding. When we think about guidance for development, we realize that the new hires lack career paths and ways to monitor their progress through the onboarding experience. And then when we think about feedback, we find that new hires, supervisors, and managers lack timely, relevant, and actionable feedback about onboarding that they can use to improve retention. So there's no retention scorecard or retention dashboard. And when we think about the individuals, we realize that the new hire orientation is seen as pretty much a long information dump. It's a 1-week training, and then they're set out into the field to perform their technical positions. They're expected to learn their job tasks via informal mentoring and through on-the-job training.
Also informal.
Which is also informal. And if you read the most recent ATD student affairs, that's where all of our training money is being spent right now, or a lot of it anyways. Supervisors and managers could train or mentor new hires, even if their lives depended on it. And we say that new hire placement is based on the organizational pain associated with a given and open position. And when you go into the instruments column, you find in the resources for the environment that there's no formal process to support onboarding throughout World Health. Also find that new hires, supervisors, and managers often lack the tools to support the onboarding process. And in the individual column, or level rather, we find that new hires are siloed inside of groups that recruit and select their own new hires differently. So there's no standardized processes either for people to recruit and hire. In the motivation column at the environmental level, we find that there's no bonuses for retention, and new hire pay is very low. We also find that monitoring new hires punishes supervisors and managers who are already saddled with a lot of extra work to do, other than mentor these new hires. And finally, we find in the motivation column at the environmental level, when we dig a little deeper, that there's wide expectations that the new hires won't last, so why sink a whole lot of time and energy into them in the first place? And at the individual level, we find that World Health recruiting and selection materials depict ideal workplace situations, rather than the actual ones that really exist. So we'll throw this out to you now. Can you think of a way that big data might be applied to this situation?
And can you use your chat window to type in some ideas? While that's happening, Lynn asked, hi Lynn, why does World Health need big data? Seems that ordinary garden variety data would be perfectly adequate. Seen one way, I'm in agreement with you. I think the here is that this is a worldwide NGO with lots and lots of people, lots spread out all over the world, and we're now looking at collecting even more data to help them with better onboarding. And so if you think about the volume, it's big. If you think about the velocity and helping people through that onboarding process, there's a lot of data, and the nature of that data is going to change as people go through that onboarding. The variety of the data could be big in that you're going to have both structured and unstructured type. And ideally, all of this, as we know as good performance improvement people, need to get to the point where the data are providing value. And Roger's pointing out that this is a mega level mission. If we use Roger Kaufman's levels, this is a societal thing.
So we actually find that there might be opportunities here to turn that big data into scorecards, as well as electronic performance support systems, such as dashboards and recommenders. So, for example, what we're seeing these days inside of the HR space is that organizations are buying into huge software management systems and talent management systems that are able to draw upon the different data sources to provide managers, a set process in which to onboard their people and provide new information to the new hires as well. So the information is being pushed out based in their dashboards and recommender systems to the people that need a more standardized approach and some step-by-step help about what to do and when to do it and what information might be necessary for these new hires.
And going back to what Roger's saying, if you look at the motivation column, there's a whole bunch of stuff there that big data is not necessarily going to address. And those motivation issues wrap up into a larger cultural issue. And I think your comment is right on point, because anything that would involve big data or any other kind of performance solution is also going to have to be fitting within that larger culture at World Health.
All right, so moving on. We have another example for a different organization that we have been involved with in the past. And we'll call this organization World Aid. And what's going on at World Aid, says the CEO, is that we're lacking the right skills and losing opportunities to meet our mission. This is an NGO that provides assistance for capacity development throughout the world. So according to this CEO, we promote our best to middle management. We develop them in a one-week leadership program and give them the tools to make a difference. But they just don't get it. They run into problems with negotiation within the organization. They're too focused on technical product design, and we're not winning the big grants. From what we know, they have the training they need, but the results just aren't appearing. So if you think about the performance gap, right, what we want our middle management to do is to lead high-performing teams to deliver project results, that achieve follow-up funding, and win big grants. And we would like them to do this in a way that means that our training is helping, because these people are being promoted from technical positions. So what happened was they're great technical workers. They're some of the best technical workers at their level. And upper management sees that and promotes them into middle management so that they can teach others how they're doing their job, and they can lead that organization and get those grants and make sure that the money is distributed and that people are meeting the needs throughout the world. What's actually happening is the technical people who are getting promoted into mid-level management position are still, they're more micromanaging. So they're more focusing on what the people below them are doing on a minute-by-minute or day-by-day kind of scale, instead of giving those people, those new technical people, the supports that they need to actually do their job, and for them to focus on writing those grants, creating those relationships with the donors, negotiating for what they need out of the donors, and supporting their people to actually do the work on the ground. So we would like our middle-level managers to get the training that they need to develop those leadership skills, those management skills, those negotiation skills. But we would also
commented clearly that they're technical folks, they're transaction oriented, and the organization is asking them to be strategic. The organization is asking them to lead. And as we know that when you promote subject matter experts to either learning situations or management situations, and you don't help them build other skills, you're asking for trouble.
Right. And so when you put that into our BEM, you find that there's a lot of areas within the BEM that we could address as performance improvement specialists and L&D leaders, strategic leaders within our organizations. Again, we find that roles and expectations are cloudy. Guidance for work process really isn't there. The guidance for development aren't very clear either. And then feedback. So the mid-level managers aren't, they're not seeing what they would do differently, or that they're not doing what the organization needs them to do because they're too focused on those technical people and not focused on writing grants and developing the skills that they need in order to lead the organization forward. With the resources, you find that there's no process or procedure to support the frontline capacity development throughout World Aid. So yes, they know how to make their people into good technical people, but they are not, the upper level management is not developing those mid-level managers in the way that they need to be developed. And so there's no process for that. There's a 1-week training that they spend a lot of money on but don't get a lot of results out of. There are problems with the financial and non-financial systems incentives. They don't get paid a lot, and they're lacking incentives for winning those grants. Mentoring new hires again, or punishes those middle managers with additional work. And so it's a lot of the same types of causes that led into our other situation as well, which we also find could be supported better with recommender systems and perhaps electronic performance support systems. So now you're a new mid-level manager. What should you be focusing on? How do you spend your days or your weeks? What are other mid-level managers doing? So keeping up to date with those who are at your level in your organization but in different departments. So breaking down those silos and working across silos again is one of the ways that big data will add perspective to the kinds of work that we're able to do.
And I'd like to make 2 points. One of the things Lynn commented on having some NGO experience is that it could be hard to see how any large volume of accurate, rapidly changing a variety types of data could be entered when you're looking at this issue around the world. It could be a big issue, and we're going to agree with you. This gets back to the culture issue and the fit issue. We do know that there's some NGOs now that are actually using big data to target things that raise a lot of money. So they found ways to work around these things. But I think it's also important to note that if you get so focused on the big data aspect because it's trendy or it's a big thing to your boss, and you forget the culture issues and you forget the feasibility issues and the organizational issues, then you can run into a world of hurt.
Right. So one specific example of where this has worked is that one of the NGOs that I used to work with, they figured out finally that they had a lot of unused resources in warehouses throughout the world. And so just by getting a handle on where those resources were and feeding that into one centralized system at headquarters, they were able to pay for the design and development of a big data system within a year. It paid for itself, it paid for the thing to be built, and it paid for the thing to be maintained, and the project is still growing. It was developed with seed money from a grant, but the minute that they implemented the project, they got every penny back that the government had spent on
really good point here, and thanks for helping us on this second example. I think your point's very well taken that, we're using the BEM, we're focusing primarily on worker level performance. And I think your point's well taken. This really is about process stuff. It's really about enterprise-wide stuff and the misalignment of processes and managerial roles. And so I think other models that do a better job of handling other levels in organizations would be helpful here.
So we'd like to hear from you again. We'd like to know, does your organization use big data for candidate selection?
And so Roger also commented that in the advanced workshop that ISP offers, they use a series of different models to do the analysis. So does it work in terms of going through a series of models, or is the idea, Roger, that there are a variety of models, and in the workshop you learn how to select and then hybrid those models in a way that's appropriate for a given project? Maybe it's both. Hi, Andrea. And so our polling's coming in too. How would you use data for candidate selection?
Well, one of the ways that we found in the literature that organizations were using data for candidate selection is that they were going through all their historical hiring records. And what they did is they took that data and they started creating correlations to look at what actually were the biggest contributing factors towards candidates staying. And they found that for, say, for example, financial managers, in order for them to be successful, it didn't really matter what kind of education they had in the past. What mattered was their typos on their CVs, and what also mattered was their prior experience on the job. So if they were detail-oriented and came into the organization with a lot of experience, they tended to stay for a long time and be very successful. However, if they hired people based on their educational backgrounds, or perhaps where they went to school, or who they recommended them, the candidates didn't really last as long at that company. So that information was again collected from a variety of different sources over a long period of time. They looked at, did the training matter that the company provided the individuals? Did their quizzes and the LMS quiz scores matter? Did their prior experience matter? It turns out yes. What about, the resumes, how those were submitted? It turns out yes. So that's one example of how people have been starting to use big data to make better candidate selections.
Andrea is saying, but it's after the fact, right? And I guess what they're doing is, the answer is yes, they're looking at what is the track record of people who have stayed, and then using that to start building better selection criteria. So this is using data that an organization has on hand, mining those data, and turning it into better selection and interviewing processes.
Right. So the win here, that may be something that we could have done in the past without big data, without setting up systems, without having those talent analytic and talent management systems, but it would have been for a one-time, one-deal shot. So we would have come in, we would have taken everything under consideration. We look through we do our analyses, we speak to our key people, we get interview data, we get survey data, we compile, we come to the same decision, right? This is what needs to happen. But then that's it. Like there's no ongoing monitoring system. With a big data approach, what you do is you take all of that information and you feed it into computer systems and software systems and analysis systems, and then you have an ongoing, up-to-the-minute report about what's happened. And you can drill down in that system. You can look at what happened in the last 6 months. You can look at what happened the last year. You can look at what happened 2 years ago. So change your policies and as you change your practices within a particular area of the organization, in this case, hiring decisions, how are hiring decisions made, you can see how those decisions have then affected longevity over time. So it's kind of like an ongoing needs assessment or evaluation that is perpetual and lasts, until you decide to change the system. Versus in the past, when we went in with our papers and pencils or maybe our Excel sheets and we collected data one time based on a specific defined period of time, that was it. There's no continuing updates, right? But now with these systems, we have the opportunity to have that up-to-date information for in perpetuity.
So that leads to Lynn's question. I'm still confused. What makes data big?
Mm-hmm.
How big does it have to be? How fast does it have to change? How much variety do you have to have before you could call it big?
Right. So that's a good question. And if you go ask somebody in the computer science world who's dealing with video data, say, of all of the cameras that we have in New York City, you're going to get a different answer than if you go to somebody who is in our space and looks at, for example, talent analytics inside of an organization. That's going to be, so the numbers aren't really as important as just knowing that you have that volume. So you're collecting from everybody in your organization, and you are collecting over a long period of time, that you have that velocity, that you're still collecting and you're getting that up-to-date information, that you have that variety, both structured and unstructured data, and that you're using it to make good decisions. So if we go back to our updated definition for people who work in our area, it's not so much about the numbers, the terabytes of information. It's just that you are able to collect information that shows patterns or changes in patterns over a period of time, that also gets up-to-date information that's constantly, continuously collected, and that is required in order to make policy decisions, programming decisions, organizational management decisions that are coming from both structured and unstructured sources that are going to help you add value to that organization. So we're not going to focus so much on the terabytes, the number of terabytes. It's the 4 B's that are collected in an ethical way to help you make and improve performance throughout your organization.
And Roger brings up a good point. To a large extent, this is what we do now. So what makes it big data is that it's going to be at a larger scale than what we've typically done. What also may make it big data is the fact that the data are so large, and the need to assemble or aggregate those data in ways that are useful is going to require us to put on our integrator hats and collaborate with more people than we have in the past.
Yeah.
In my career, I was, as a consultant, I was used to working with IT people. I was not used to working with data analysts. I was not used to working with people who are experts in data visualization. We weren't, and the IT people weren't used to working with those computer science people and those data people. So I think, where this is different than what we've done is that the cast of characters we're going to play with is going to be bigger, and that's going to have us rely on our performance improvement principles to be the integrators who are behind these larger collaborations.
Also, those pre-made talent management and HR analytics systems, they go for, considerable amounts of money. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't cost that much money to build these systems. It's expensive, but as we've seen from examples in the NGO world, they're doable, and they'll even pay for themselves several times over if you cost them out the right way and you target the exact need that your organization has. They'll pay for themselves. So we're advocating that, just like when in the early days of web pages, you know, you could hire somebody to build your company a web page for, you know, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of dollars, or you could break out your HTML code book and put one up online quick and easy for yourselves. The same thing is going on here now in this space. There are solutions that are out there that are far too expensive for mid-sized companies and smaller companies to purchase. But if they were to go out and hire one of us to work with a data scientist and a systems engineer, the three of us together could come up with big data analytics systems for them to use. Ellen Wagner helped build the first system that she built. They built it for something like $10,000. So we want people to start taking notice of this inside of our field and start to figure out who they need to connect with and how they need to connect with them so that we can bring the solution to companies that are maybe not your but Bayer, you know, pharmaceuticals. Maybe we can bring these to companies such as smaller organizations that might not have the same budget to purchase Talio. I know Boise State just purchased Talio, and it was quite an endeavor on their account. And so there's a lot of organizations out there that can't afford those fancy flagship software enterprise systems, but could still benefit from us working with a few key people in their organization to get them the data that they need to make good decisions.
We've reached a point where we've come to the end of our allocated time for our webinar. Part of that is because of the technical difficulties we experienced earlier. So I think at this point we'd like to answer Elisa's question and take one more before we have to call it a day.
All right.
Elisa asked, for smaller organizations, what would you recommend for them to maintain a system like that?
Right. Well, we're saying that you could help smaller organizations with a boutique solution, and that solution would depend on what questions they're trying to answer. Are they having high turnover rates? Are they not winning the grants that they need? So it's really going to depend on what it is that you've decided makes a worthy problem. And that goes back to some of our more basic strategies to define a problem and cost it out.
And I think the other thing is these recommendations come out of that collaboration among performance improvement folks, IT folks, big data analysis folks, and it's not until those people are working together to frame the nature of the problem or the opportunity to determine that it's worth closing, to look at causes, are you going to start seeing enough information on the table to start getting into recommendations for how to create it, how to implement it, how to maintain it. Linda commented that the term big data has a lot of loaded meaning, and we agree. In fact, it's so trendy now that the term may not have a lot of intrinsic meaning to it. And she suggests framing this about using strategies from big data to design analytics would make more sense.
Well, analytics are the processes that you use to make decisions. Big data is the type of information that you need to collect. So big data and analytics are used together to get you the solutions or the answers to the questions that you have. In our last presentation, we took time to define both of those words, and perhaps that's something that we need to do in the future.
Yeah, and Roger said there are many people in the organization collecting data. I would add to that there are lots of people providing data. It's our job to find out where it is in the organization, and I not only would we agree, I think the other thing we would agree on, Roger, is that it's our job not only to find out where it is, but to analyze those data in ways that deliver value to the organization. So Elise commented, essentially it's to know why you are collecting the data is most important.
Yeah.
I think having the answer to that question is really good. One of the things that strikes me is that, you know, big data is part of a huge change coming down the pike. When you think about, you know, what keeps executives and chief information officers up at night, it's things like big data, the cloud, mobile computing, the larger move towards digitization, there we go. And each one of those words has all the pressing urgency of, you know, trendy buzzwords. And I think one way that prudent or savvy practitioners respond to that is, you know, being fairly rigorous in our approach. And I think if, regardless of whose problem-solving approaches you use, whether it's our performance improvement approach, whether you look at other problem-solving approaches coming out of business, quality improvement, coming out of programming, that problem representation stuff is really important, and knowing what the problem is and why you're trying to solve it are really important things to determine before you start getting too far down the pike.
Correct.
I also think one of the things that struck me as I first began becoming interested in big data is at first it was rather intimidating. I was sitting there thinking, you know, I come from a performance support background. I'm used to creating large-scale performance support systems, which is something that DLS Group and Deborah Stone and I and our peers did for a long time. And I was a little scared that this was new and I had nothing to offer and no value. One of the things that struck us as we've researched more and more into these big data opportunities is that this is a natural place for performance improvement practitioners like us. Both of the NGO examples that we provided, warts and all, still point back to things that we could look at 20 years ago and say, wow, you know, there's a need for better feedback. There's a need for a dashboard here. There's a need for performance support here. Those things are still going to be the same. It's just now we're doing it with more data behind it, and we're playing with more people to pull off these interventions.
Right. So that we aren't maybe necessarily the people ourselves that are collecting the data, versus in the past we were creating out the surveys, we were sending out the surveys, we were doing the interviews. You know, now there are new methods and techniques that are out there that if we work with people in the IT department, inside the data science department, and of the organization, or if you bring those people with you to an organization, you are able to a lot of times get answers to questions based on what they already have in their system.
And as Roger's pointing out too, the other cool opportunity here is something that's been part of our performance improvement toolkit for a while. And that's the realization that a lot of our organizations are still working in silos. And if you've got an organization that's doing it, just the sheer volume, velocity, and so on of what we're trying to do, you know, it runs counter to that. These big data opportunities are fantastic places to start building cross-silo teams and start building collaborations and partnerships that get across the siloed parts of our organization. Because as Roger's noting, yeah, you're going to have to go across the silos if you want to get that data.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much for having us present today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for the opportunity.
Yeah.
ISPI rocks.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.